Great. So, good morning. It's really nice to be learning with all of you. As part of the Spherisman at Drisha, welcome to the second session of When Moses Went Up to Heaven, Aggadot of Matan Torah with Miss Miriam Gedwiser. Or you have
I
Rabbanit in your.
promoted myself. We could talk about it
Okay.
another time.
Excellent. Okay, so as usual, I've invited everyone to join as a panelist. Um, so that means that you'll be able to unmute yourself when we pause for questions, and we'll be able to see your faces, which would be a nice way to start the day, but optional. So I'm going to send out those invitations again once we get going. Um, and if you have any questions between, or moments to pause, you can put them in the chat here on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Robin Gedwiser. Okay, I think that's all on my side.
Okay, thanks, Maxine. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming back. Those of us who did. So today, I think probably for maybe next time actually not, but for this, we're gonna go back to this very long Aggadah on Shabbat Pechet, 88, which we saw part of it last time and we talked about the idea of sort of like, I guess if I could recap. I don't know, you can disagree if you were here, but the idea of sort of the way that the Aggadot talk about the unease or difficulty of sort of like having a meeting between the upper and lower realms, which is what Matan Torah is, and sort of Aggadot about maybe God coming from different directions or different things to kind of like try and explain that. Today I want to go back to sort of a different family of stories or comments about Matan Torah, specifically regarding angels. I'll share in the chat but first I'm gonna a source sheet, unless Maxine has a PDF version that you want to give to people. But I do have one. And that will be our basis point. Unlike last week, I'm gonna also hopefully bring in some more later views on these same Gemaras. So here we are, and I'll share my screen also. But if you want to follow along, if you want to revisit later, then you can. And of course, holler with questions. So we're going to start and I called it Moses versus the angels, which is already prejudging, I guess, this encounter for reasons that we'll see soon. But the first text we read is not actually a text of opposition. Like I said, this is like 2 pages of a Aggadot about Matan Torah. So Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, "B'sha'ah shehikdimu Yisrael na'aseh l'nishma." When the Jews put na'aseh before nishma, and as we saw last week, right, that actually happens in the Torah. Those words appear after the Aseret HaDivrot, the Decalogue, but okay, they're always understood to be sort of part of the initial revelation. Always is probably an overstatement, but traditionally, I think that's fair to say. Istabakol. So Abat Kol came out and said to them, which is interesting. I think Ben Yehuda, who we'll see later, sort of comments on this, right? Like, who's the Bat Kol talking to? It says, who revealed to my sons this secret, that is actually used by the ministering angels? And here's a proof that it's used by the ministering angels, right? That bless Lord, you angels of his, you mighty in strength, that fulfill his word, hearkening unto his voice of his words, right? Osim comes before, Osei Dvaro comes before Lishmoa, Bakol Dvaro, Beresha Osei Vahadar Lishmoa, right? So it's the same order of events as Nasev and Ishma. Beautiful. Okay, so Bakol is asking like this rhetorical question. Well, I don't know if it's rhetorical or not. Who told my children, meaning Bnei Israel, this secret? It's just interesting to know, right, that like the audience of that question is Bnei Israel. And it seems like it's not necessarily a question, right? It is a rhetorical question. It's just telling them that this is an angelic thing that you have just done. So that's an interesting opening. I put like 3 dots here because there's a lot that happens in between this and the statements of Rabbi Shimon Levi that we're about to see, right? But this is a a vision of kind of like, at the time of Matan Torah, Bnei Israel they're like angels, right? And they're like angels in the Nasiv and Nishma way. Whatever Nasiv and Nishma is, that's what makes Bnei Israel like angels. So I know there's not so many of us here, so I'll pause, and if somebody wants us to offer a thought as to why, right? Why is Nasiv and Nishma an angelic thing to do, right? And if not, I have some ideas. That's why I'm here. But all right. So I think that, yeah, no, please.
I guess when when angels get, directives from God, they don't, stop to think about it first. It's just they just do it.
Right.
Um,
I forgot to share my screen, didn't I? Yes. I'm here though now. Um, great. So yeah, right. Angels just do, right? The idea is that there's not a step in between anything, right? Like when an angel hears something, they just do it because they don't have an intervening will, right? That's what we often think about, right? And actually, this is going to come up later, but angels sort of like they live in a different plane. Let's say, I mean, whatever angels are, okay. Um, for this purpose, I'm treating them as some sort of a literary character, honestly. But like, right, whatever angels are, they don't have their independent will. They are just agents of God. God says things or directs things, and they just happen by angelic sort of agency. So it's saying that Bnei Israel are like that by suspending Nishma in favor of Naaseh. It's like they're able to just kind of do that. Um, actually, Rav Kook says about this. So this didn't make it to the source sheet. Sorry, but Rav Kook says about this something similar to that, or a little more than that, actually, right? That angels sort of are acting on their nature. They don't need to hear because it's just sort of they're aligned, right? They do what God wants because that's what they are. And that the idea that Bnei Israel can say Naaseh and Nishma is making a similar claim that Jews somewhere in our heart are already aligned with God. So we can just do it. And then we're really trying to get to, like, in practice, we might not always experience it that way, but we're trying to sort of like express that part of ourselves that it's already there. It's already there and you just have to express it. Which is an interesting view of like, there's a lot of things that are interesting about that. First of all, like for Rav Kook, it's about like this national experience, and right, like the Jews collectively are already there, aligned with God, which has like a lot of both interesting and potentially very fraught ramifications, which we can all imagine. I don't know if we can imagine, but if you can't imagine, then be happy. And if you can, right, like at what point? I guess the big question is, right, like if there's something in you that's already aligned with God, right? Like how much can you trust your intuition over, let's say, a text or something outside of you? How do you balance those things? I think an interesting thing, I don't know how to say this. I usually get in trouble when I say things about religious Zionism, which is not like a thing that I know that I'm like super immersed in right now. But in my experiences being more connected with the religious Zionist world when I was studying in Israel, an interesting thing that like shocked me, right, that I heard from some Israeli teachers say at Midrash Linimam that I would never hear from an American teacher there would be like, well, I'm balancing like the voice of God within me with like what I know the halacha says. I was like, what are you talking about? But that's sort of an extension of this potential idea of Rav Kook here, right? That Naaseh Nishma is about like a pre-existing alignment, and the question is, how far do you trust that that's what's going on when you have an impulse to do something? So I think that that's like a big question, and we're going to see actually sort of a totally opposite take on the relationship of humans to angels later in a different thinker. But at this point, right, humans and angels are aligned, and it seems like it has something to do with the perfection of humans and their removal from the usual vicissitudes of the world. Is that fair? No, that makes like I don't know. You could tell me if you think you like that reading, but I think that's kind of how it is, right? Like God is telling Bnei Israel in this indirect way. First of all, through a bat kol, and second of all, by asking a question to an audience who's not there, right? Letting them in on it's almost like letting them in on the secret, some discussion upstairs, right? Letting them in on the secret of like, oh, you guys hit the jackpot. You're doing the same thing that the angels are doing. Great.
Wait,
So
can I
that's
ask a question?
please.
I'm a little confused. So like let's say you're not sure whether it's coming from you or God. Like if it's coming from God, wouldn't it be better advice or a better action choice than if it's coming from you? So who cares?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the claim is more that sometimes your intuition expresses something that is in fact from God. I mean, I'm making a lot of like a few lines of quick here, which I didn't even write for you, but like I think this idea exists in every place, right? So it is some Hasidic commentaries also, right? Sometimes your intuition expresses things, so it's true, right? It is, right? I think actually, maybe I didn't express it clearly because I think what you're saying is true, right? If it's just like, oh, that seems wrong to me, then that's kind of like, okay, it seems wrong to you, whatever the Torah says X, Y, Z. But if sometimes something seeming wrong, like you can trust yourself to be aligned or to be sort of already expressing a divine message, then all of a sudden your intuition becomes much more important if it's curated properly. I mean, there's so many caveats, right? It has to be curated, it has to be whatever, because we can't, I don't think anyone would say like, oh, therefore do whatever you want because your intuition is expressing of divine will, right? Like that's not where we're going, but there's some sense in which at least sometimes, right? Maybe at the moment of Matan Torah where you're kind of like having this, you've prepared for it and whatever, where you already know, you don't need to hear because you already know the thing you have to do, right? They still are also going to hear it, right? But the idea of Na'aseh v'nishma is that there's something in them that already knows. Is that responsive?
So your concern is that there is a space inside of me and every Jew where we already know what Hashem wants. And there is also a space where, I have my id or whatever it is that's like, hey, this is actually what God wants. And it's like, no, not really. But, you can convince yourself. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? Like it's very nice in theory to say like there's something inside of us that's aligned with what God wants. But then when it comes down to like choices, right? How do you know what voice inside of yourself is speaking? I guess is fair. Or how do you know which sort of part of yourself, or if you've truly accessed the part of yourself that's aligned with what God wants or not?
Gotcha.
That's maybe a way to say it.
I mean, I feel like that's I don't think that negates or even like disrupts or problematizes like the idea that we also have God's voice or whatever that might mean inside of us, right? Because like, isn't that, oh, this is so off topic. Let's take it offline, but I'd love to talk more about it.
Sure. Holler. I'd love to hear about it. I think that I'll put it this way. I grew up, and maybe other people have different ways. I've been thinking about my early education a lot, but I came from a tradition in which like there was a bit, I don't know, tradition. Actually, it is a tradition. It comes from like the Rav and whatever. I went to Maimonides, right? Like this big emphasis on like the heteronymous nature of halacha, and it's from outside of you, and it's imposed on you, and you bend your will to it. And I guess like that's not the only way of seeing it, right? But I think in the end of the day, these kind of questions of like, well, how do you know if you're doing what's right, if you're expressing a higher level of your sort of existence versus if you're expressing sort of like a base level of your existence, exists in all these different framings. It exists the same way, like, how do I know I'm interpreting halacha correctly versus how I want it to be, right? So I think those are like, they're not the same theologically, right? Halacha is imposed on me, and I always have to like decide if I'm interpreting a good faith versus like halacha is like, or not halacha, but what God wants is sort of in part expressed through my own alignment with it, but I still have to sort of like figure out what's actually going on inside of me. I don't know if that's responsive, but yeah, we can move on. But thank you for your thoughts. So that's the first vision is right. Like the Jews, when they receive the Torah, are like angels, and in a sense, it seems like they're aligned with God's will. Right. They're so aligned they don't even need to hear it. Maybe that's an interpretation of this text, but it's not a crazy interpretation of Na'aseh v'nishma. Or they're so aligned, right? The other side would be like they're so willing to accept authority from outside they don't even need to hear what it is, right? In any case, we'll see that maybe the Jews are there, but the angels themselves are third party. I was about to call them non-player characters, but it's an interesting question as to whether they are or are not player characters. Sorry, if you don't have like a 10-year-old son, maybe that's not as interesting to you, or spend all your day with teenagers. But anywho, if you want another time to talk about all the weird things that 12-year-old boys say, just holler. So here's another statement. And there's like a series of like 5, 6, I don't know, a lot of statements of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi about Matan Torah. I took a few of them in the same sugya, right? We just had Rabbi Elazar, we're going to have Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi now. There's a lot of them, and did that just get bigger? It didn't get bigger. Let's see what we can do. That's nice. That's pretty. Okay, Bama Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also said, so this is not the first thing he's saying in the sugya, it's not the last, we just skipped a bunch of stuff. This is like my personal curation, so you could decide what you think about it after. This is great Tikkun Leil Shavuos material, if you want to just like pick up these few pages of Gemara. Okay, I'm going to tell another story about myself. When I was like 19 and I spent like 2 weeks in the Beit Midrash of Migdalos, and they had like one computer that had response on it. This is like the olden days of internet research, right? And Judaica. So like there was one computer that had response, and I remember like I put in these words, and there's like 70 Midrashim, and I just like went through all of them. I don't remember exactly what I concluded, but there's a few families, right? We're going to see one extremely famous one next week, God willing. But here's one, right? This is one family. There's a bunch of versions of the Midrash. I'm bringing the one that's in the Torah, in the Talmud. Sorry. When Moshe went up to heaven, and it seems like this is, as we're going to talk about maybe later today and maybe next time, Moshe goes up to heaven or up the mountain twice, right? This seems pretty clearly to be about the first time. We'll have some interesting questions about whether every story that begins when Moshe went up to heaven is actually about the first time Moshe went up to receive the tablets, right? And then the second time after Chet HaEgel, he goes again. So this is, I think, for sure the first time. So the ministering angel said, before God, which is a sort of, they use the terminology, they said before God as opposed to God, because it's supposed to be like a little less anthropomorphic. You have this in the Targum also. Ribono shel olam, master of the universe. Ma liyilud isha b'neinu. What is a person, a woman-born entity doing among us? The commentators go crazy about this. Why is he called Yilud Isha? But it seems like it's kind of like emphasizing his materiality, his physicality, his. I've been teaching sugyas about abortion with my 11th graders, and I'm just like trying to get them to understand like how messy and gross childbirth is. I don't know why, but it's. I think it's calling that. It's like this guy who came from like this gross process, right? Maybe most of us are women. Many of us may have had children. We might like disagree with that as a full characterization of the birth process, but I think that it's keying in that like. Moshe, like, what is he even doing here? He started off as this like wiggly baby who was gross and couldn't do anything, and like, why is he even here? How does he belong here? Amar Lahen, he said to them. It's actually, now that I'm saying that, it's interesting to harken back to Moshe himself as a baby, because there's also Midrashim about Moshe was a special baby, he was shiny, he was perfect, whatever. So like those Midrashim are also already a little bit responsive to this question of like, how could somebody so holy start off so gross? Okay, Amar Lahen. So he said to them, L'kabel Torah. God said, oh, Moshe's here to get the Torah, right? Which is kind of like a cute thing. Like because obviously like they're going to be annoyed. Amr lefanav chamdak enuzak shekenuzalach teisha me'od v'shivim ba'arba darot. Right, this very special treasure that you have hidden for 974 generations before the creation of the world. There's like a whole other set of midrashim about where that number comes from, but okay. You want to give it to flesh and blood, right? Meaning like, what are you even doing, right? Like our original question still stands. We said, why are you letting this gross human being up in heaven? And you're like, oh, I'm giving him the Torah. Well, that makes it even worse. Why are you giving a gross human being the Torah, right? The Torah like is a heavenly object. Why would you give that to a person? And then they say this verse from Tehillim, Ma enosh ki tizkerenu, what is a human that you would even be mindful of him? Uven adam ki tifkedenu, and the Son of Man that you think of him, right? Okay. Hashem Adonenu, Ma adir shimcha b'chol haaretz asher tenahodcha el hashamayim, right? Rather the alternative of a pasuk from earlier in the same Mizmor, God, our Lord, how glorious is your name in all the earth. Your majesty is placed above in the heavens. The majesty here is the Torah, right? What, right? Like you shouldn't think about people. Your special treasure, the Torah, should stay up here in the majestic place. So Amar lo Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. So God says to Moshe, right? Not Amar Lahem. God says to the angels. God says to Moshe, Hashem hachzir lahem tshuva, return an answer to them. Okay, put him on the spot a little bit. He cold called Moshe. Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam. He said to Moshe was like, I'm a little worried that they're going to burn me with their breath, which is kind of a nice way of saying like, this doesn't seem like this is above my pay grade kind of situation. And it could be, meaning Moshe is acutely aware, it seems, that he is of a different sort than a different kind than the entities that exist in heaven. And he's like, I'm willing to accept the Torah, but I can't actually exist on equal footing up here, right? And I guess if I didn't preface this fully, right, but what I think these midrashim are about is about that question or tension, similar to last week a little bit, but like, how can something that's like so supernal exist in our world or come into our world, right? So here Moshe is kind of the bridge, but Moshe himself is uncertain as to how he's supposed to cross that divide, or concerned, afraid. Amar sorry. Amar lahem. So God said, Amar lo, I just highlighted, if you can see, Achoz b'chisei kivodi. Hold on to my throne of glory, v'chazor lahen shuva, and then you can answer them. And I think there's other versions where like God protects Moshe in slightly different ways. Hold on to my throne, meaning when you read it here, it's almost like, it's like a base in a game of tag. Hold on to my throne and they can't touch you. But we're going to see an interpretation of like why that particular thing. It kind of depends on like, what is the throne of glory? What does that represent, right? Does anyone know anything about the Kisei HaKavod, the way we talk about it? No? Okay. There are many interesting things about it. One thing I'll say, which we don't have, but just is inside, for example, at the end of Mishpatim, there's like this weird theophany vision of God, and it says that below God's feet, Kimaseh Livnat HaSapir, like a sapphire brick, it's the Mishamayim, the Tohar, right? There's another midrash that says that the luchot are made out of sapphire, right? The luchot are made out of this footrest at God's throne in some way, right? That's one vision. We'll meet something else about them. No spoilers. We'll meet something else about the Kisei HaKavod later. So God says, hold on to my throne. It seems like it's a sort of protection that we're going to see. There could be other interpretations. Answer them. Right, because here's another pasuk. He caused him to grasp the front of his throne and spread his clouds over it. So right, there's a pasuk in Eov. Eov was wonderful for Midrash because I really think no one understands what it means. Maybe that's just my confession that I don't understand what it means. I have a colleague who teaches Eov who maybe thinks it does have like make sense, but anyways, great for Midrash. And so right, here's a pasuk where God tells somebody to hold on to his. And interesting, I'm going to just note this word, say the face of the throne. Hold that thought. Okay. V'amar Rabbi Nachman, right? Melamed sheperash Hashem shakai miziv shchinato v'anano alav. God sort of like enveloped him in the splendor of his shechina and cloud, meaning those are the things that are going to protect you from the fiery breath of the angels. That's actually also there's a much larger opposition between fire and clouds, I would say, in the imagery of Matan Torah, which is that the mountain is all fiery, but then Moshe goes into a cloud. God descends on a cloud. I heard this once from a Lichtenstein, like a Sikha in 1999, which was a long time ago. It's like one of the few times that I heard him speak personally and understood what he was saying. And one of the few times I heard him speak like face to face at all. It was a Gush Chanukah Chagika, where me and like two other girls went to visit like one of the couples because we were learning with their wife, and it was extremely awkward. But I learned the following interesting thing, which I have come back to many times, which is right this opposition between fire and clouds in the story of Matan Torah, which you can look through in Shemot and see it, and also in Devarim and see it in many ways, is about sort of like the mysterium tremendum versus the rational sort of like the things you can understand, the light, the fire, but that at some point in order to act, like revelation involves the clouds, something you can't understand. You could see this in the structure of the Mishkan, where the two things that bookend Parshat Truma, I believe, maybe Parshat Tetzaveh, one of them, are the menorah and the Ketoret, right? One generates light, one generates a cloud. They're sort of like these two modalities, and they have to go together to encounter God. But there's always something that you don't understand. So it's kind of interesting that God is telling Moshe, like, no, you belong up here. You can answer back these angels. The angels have sort of the power of the fire of like a pretty decent argument, which is like, this whole thing, like all these supernal entities like just don't belong with people. And Moshe needs to be sort of like bridge that with something other than a rational argument, maybe. But he is going to make an actually pretty good argument. Right. So Moshe said to God, interesting, not to them, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, Torah shetanoteni ma k'tiv ba. What's written in it? Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. So Moshe, and it seems like Moshe, that seems also like maybe Moshe has a little prior knowledge of that. Maybe because actually, right, Moshe was downstairs when all of Bnei Israel heard the first two Dibrot. So he already knows what's going to be in the Sarah Dibrot, or something like that. Or maybe he already knows all the Sarah Dibrot and that he's going up to get the rest of the Torah. It depends exactly on that chronology. But so he says to the angel of Mitzrayim, did you go down to Egypt? Have you been slaves to Paro? Torah lama tehelachem. What does the Torah do for you? Right? And he's going to give a bunch of examples, which are basically like the Torah is written for us. Right? And you can understand that in a literal way. Like the Torah is literally written about experiences that we have. Or you can also understand in a little more abstract way, which we'll get to in a second. Right? Shuv makativa. What else does it say? Lo yeh l'cha elokim achirim. You shouldn't have any other gods. Bein hagoyim atem shurim she'ovdim. Do you guys, are there like people doing avodah zarah up in heaven that you need to be warned not to do it? Right? Another thing, right? Zachor Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. Do you guys even do malacha that you can take a rest from? Right? Like what is like all of these mitzvot, right? We're going through basically the Sarah Hebrew. Shuv maktiva lo tisa, right? Don't take God's name in vain. Masa metan yesh b'nechem. Well, actually, whatever. That's an interesting question. Do you guys have business contracts where you would be prohibited to swear? I actually just witnessed a hysterical interaction between I happen to be teaching last week. I taught from home. I think I happen to be teaching this week from school. So I'm thinking very much in school terms, right? I'm a high school teacher the rest of my life. And I saw an hysterical interaction between a kid and a teacher. She's like, oh, how is your, well, I'll switch the body part in the option. Somebody, well, how's your foot? And he's like, I swear to God, I went to the podiatrist yesterday. And she's like, I didn't say anything. I just asked how your foot is. What does that tell you? He definitely did not go to the podiatrist yesterday, right? Like he told her he was going there, but he went somewhere else, right? But like, right. So that's like, don't do that. But it's basically saying like, angels, like, do you guys have like these kind of things where you're trying to get one over on another person and you're tempted to swear falsely? No, right? Yeah. You know, some people are better liars than that, but not all. Maybe he's not lying. I don't know. Right. What's another thing? Honor your father and your mother. Do you even have fathers and mothers? Right. Lo tirtzach. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. Don't steal. Do you guys do any of that stuff? Do you get jealous and angry with each other? Do you have a yetzer hara where you're tempted to sin? Right. Like what? The point is like all of these things are not for you. And these are all Sarah Hebrew, right? Moshe, in some ways, is using the information he might already have about a Sarah Hebrew. He doesn't actually know about the rest of the Torah, but that's okay because the Sarah Hebrew is enough. These are not for you, angels. Why are you being so possessive? This was obviously written for us, which honestly, the angels know, right? Presumably. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but here it's miyad hodula kadosh baruch hu, right? I think often in these midrashim about angels, the angels are expressing a perspective, right? They're expressing like a hava min almost, something you might have thought. Right, you could be forgiven for thinking that like if the Torah is a product of like God's supernal intellect and like whatever it is sort of like exists high in heaven and reflects these deep truths about the universe, that it's incommensurate with being given to people. And the answer so far is like, well, actually the Torah is written for people, right? It's intended to bridge that gap. But there's still the question of like, how do you do that? How do you bridge that gap? Right? If it's written about like, don't steal, don't murder, don't swear falsely, then like, how is it also the supernal thing that's sort of up there and connects to God in some deep way? So that I think we're going to hopefully see people working through a little bit. Right? Miyad, kol achad, sorry. Miyad hodulo lakadosh baruch hu. So immediately the angels conceded to God. Shne'emar Hashem Adonenu ma'adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. They said, you know what, God, you're right. Your name is so great in all the earth. Keywords, I think there, all the earth. Asher tenahodcha al hashamayim. V'ilu asher tenahodcha al hashamayim lo kativ. Right, that your majesty is placed above the heavens is not there. I think that probably there's two versions of that same verse, but let's look back at where that other one was. Asher tenahodcha al hashamayim is the beginning of that perek, right? how glorious is your name on earth. Your majesty is placed above the heaven in the beginning of the parak. And a similar pasuk appears later, but without the part about the heaven. Just like, you're right, God, your majesty can go to earth. So like it's that they're reading that chapter of Tehillim as kind of like a development in the perspective of the angels. Fine. So they're willing to be like, you know what? God's glory can go to earth. Miad, immediately, kol echad ve'echad na'asa lo ohev. All the angels became his best friend. U'masar lo davar, and they all gave him a secret. Shne'emar alita lemarom shavita shavi, lakachta matanot ba'adam. You went up to heaven, you took captive. Who's the captive? An interesting thing. And you took gifts on account of it. The rest of the pasuk is even among the rebellious, also that the Lord God might dwell there, right? The rebellious might be the angels, right? So Moshe has sort of like almost unwittingly extracted something from the angels and also received gifts, right? And we're going to have an example of a gift, which is super interesting, which is also, I think, like this moment is interesting because Moshe went up to get the Torah. But it's also saying when you go to heaven, you get other things also, right? You learn other things about the universe, or you want to learn other things about the universe that can inform you beyond the Torah, right? Moshe's going to learn things that he's going to get a particular secret. Next time, like I said, we're going to see, well, maybe this is, you can tell me if you know what I'm talking about, right? But there are some things that Moshe wants to learn about the way the universe works that he's not successful in learning, specifically why do bad things happen to good people, right? A famous Aggadot about that, which we'll see next time. But right, in this case, the angels all become his best friend. They give him a present, and Bishar shekaraucha adam lakachta matanot. Lakachta matanot ba'adam. What does it mean? You took gifts on account of man. That's how they're translating it, right? Because the angels were so down on you being human and earthly and whatever, that's why they ended up having to give you a gift. And here's a gift. Af malach hamavet masar lo davar. Even the angel of death gave him something. Shne'emar. What is the angel of death? Later in Bamidbar, Aaron places, interestingly, the Ketorah, right, this smoky thing, and he stops the plague that comes from Kivrot HaTaba, I believe. So from when the Jewish people complain. So he stood between the dead and the living. If the angel of death hadn't told Moshe this special secret, how could Aaron possibly have known? Which there's a lot to unpack there, but for another time. But basically that like Moshe, he's not just learning Torah, instructions for life. He's learning about, in C.S. Lewis terms, like the deep magic of the universe, right? Like secrets about how cosmic things operate. And that's part of what he comes down with, although that might not be, he might not transmit that to everybody. That might be, there's certain things, like the Torah is supposed to bridge this gap. Moshe is the conduit by which the Torah bridges a gap for us, right? But it seems like some of the stuff that Moshe gets, just Moshe gets. And that's a preview also for what's about to come. The Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also said, "B'sha'ah she'yarad Moshe l'milifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu." Well, I'm going to pause there for a second. I'm going to go look at a commentary. Maybe we'll come back to it. Now we're going to have sort of another exchange with a different angel. But there's a bunch of Aggadot about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and angels and Matan Torah that all appear in a row here. But I wanted to look at sorry. I thought I was so smart balancing my computer on these little boxes to make it the right height, but apparently not. Let's look at a commentary for a second. Here's the Ben Yehoyada, which is Ben Ish Chai on Shabbat. This is an excerpt. I find the Ben Yehoyada, I like it. First of all, it's on Sefaria. I feel like it's become like 100 times more popular in the last 5 years by being on Sefaria, certainly for me, but that's fine. That's why Sefaria exists. So he's interpreting this thing. He gets, sometimes it's like a little too, I'll put it this way. He takes very seriously things like gematria and like whatever, and trying to sort of assume that all midrashim are aware of each other. That might not always be true, but I think sometimes those can make larger points anyway. Like here, for example, Tanahotcha al Hashemayim. We'll see an example of that in 1 second, right? He's explaining this part of a verse where the angels initially say, "Your Majesty is placed above the heavens," meaning like, how can you give the Torah to earth when it belongs up here? Asub shara. They wanted to make a compromise. Ata. Right? They said, let's make a pshara now. Shetitain lo rak Torah shebichtav. Right? He's saying, when they say Tanahotcha al Hashemayim, it's not what the pshat of the Gemara sounds like, which is put your Torah up in heaven. Rather, why don't you just give Moshe the Torah Shebichtav? We know it exists. We know it says all these things about humans, and it seems like it's written for humans. So fine, give him that thing, right? Shehi Tanakh. Why is that in bold? Because Tanakh is alluded to by the adjacent letters in the word Shemayim, heaven. This is my translation, so I apologize for any little errors. What does that mean, adjacent letters in the word Shemayim? The letter after Shin is Taf. The letter after Mem is Nun. The letter after Yud is Tav. Okay, fine. So this is what I mean. But do I think that that's what Shemayim means? It's an allusion to Tanakh. I don't know. But the point he's going to make about Torah Sheba'al Peh and Torah Shebiktav, I think is very interesting. So let's stick with that. Va'al Ritzono Lamar, right? What I mean to say is Samuch Achar Shemei Yesh Tanakh v'Hamem Kefula. Fine, right? Shemayim is kind of double. Maybe he's alluding to the double Torah. I'm not 100% sure. Gamarmu al Hashemayim ki Torah shebichtav hi bichinat Shemayim. Right? You can give him the Torah shebichtav, which is, by the way, associated with heaven. But the oral Torah is associated with the earth. Right? But in the end, right? And then this pasuk that the angels quote in the Gemara, Ma Adam Kitis Kirenu, he reads as that's Torah Shebichtav, Uven Adam Kitif Kidenu, right, with Torah Sheba'al Peh. Therefore, right, you already told him to give him something, but at least only give him the Torah Shebichtav. Which, okay. Any thoughts or reactions to that? So I'll say one thing. First of all, in the Ben Yehoyada's break, right? The Torah Shebichtav is the Shemayim. Torah Sheba'al Peh is the Eretz, which actually makes total sense to me. I don't know if other people listen again, right? Some people imagine Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, they're really the same. They both are just part of what Moshe receives in heaven. But if you think of Torah Sheba'al Peh as at least in part something that humans work on and shape, which I do, right? Then this characterization makes a lot of sense, right? But here's the question. Right? If you were the angels and you were going to give people one thing, right? Would you want to give them the thing that is fully associated with the heaven or the thing that's not fully associated with the heaven? Right? It seems kind of almost backwards. It's oh, just give them the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Shemayim thing. Sorry, the Shemayim thing. We'll keep the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Eretz thing. That's a little odd or surprising or interesting. So that's just a thing to notice. I think it's sort of an interesting. It's hinting at a suggestion of what does it mean to give the Torah and try and bridge this gap between smelly physical people and this supernal entity, which is that actually, right, the Torah Sheba'al Peh has a big part of that process, right? The Torah Sheba'al Peh, Shebichtav, it could be up there or it could be down here. But once it's down here, it's almost no longer up there, right? Whereas the Torah Sheba'al Peh is the thing that keeps the connection in some way. Right, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the process that people go through to try and understand, or to try and interpret, or to try and make sense, or to decide, is the thing that gives them access to some sort of divine secrets, or a way of being that's sort of more threatening to the angels in some way. I thought that was curious that he puts it that way, but also interesting. And he continues, Amarla Kadosh Baruch Hu. Now God says to him, This is a separate comment of his, I think, but right. God says, answer them. And he's going to say here, right, I want to call you Moshe. Netzach, Moshe is associated with the sphere of Netzach. Okay. Because okay. Right. And Moshe is worried that they're going to burn him. Dehein emet, because they stand for truth. Kenny Hevel, and they're right, actually. I'm nothing. I don't belong here. So I'm worried that they're going to say I'm nothing and I'm going to poof, disappear. Sort of an over reading of Hevel Shebafim, right? Right. So God says to him, hold on to my kisei hakavod, right? I said, we're going to have to figure out what does that mean, my kisei hakavod. So here's what the Ben Yehoyada says. Ramaz lo dvarim elu. Koach ta'ana. God is hinting at him what his response should be, which is Kisei Kavod Hu Ulam HaBria. There's 4 Kabbalistic worlds. Bria is the second from the top. Okay, the throne comes from the world of Bria, which is a certain type of creation, which is, so do the Jews, right? And the angels actually come from the next world to be Yetzirah. So basically, God is telling him, actually, Moshe, you have an argument, which is you're closer to me. In other places, I saw somebody refer to this as, or he actually refers to this in a previous passage as Dina Devar Matzra, right? Which is this Nazikian idea that the neighbor to a plot of land that's being sold, the owner of the adjacent plot has a right of first refusal. So basically, God is telling Moshe, like, you're the neighbor. You actually are more adjacent to the Torah than they are, so you have more of a claim than they do. Which is not exactly what Moshe says. So he has to read that a little bit differently. But right, there's some sense where he's sort of like subverting this idea, as opposed to the pshat of the Gemara, which is Moshe goes upstairs, the angels are like, how this doesn't work, and Moshe's like, no, actually the Torah is written for the world. Here it's also like, actually, like, the Torah and I have something in common, which is not like our base physicality, but like that I have some spiritual potential that's above you, actually. Which that's something I think to unpack a little bit. What is the spiritual potential of people that the Torah speaks to, that is above? Here, I'll fix this in real time. That's above what the angels have. So I think that I want to go back to, I want to do two things. First, I want to show a little piyut, which is source 4. And then I want to go back to our Gemara. I was directed to this by Isaac Mayer, who was a former Drisha student. But it's in an article from the Torah, sort of quoting the Torah.com, quoting old Aramaic poems, like liturgical poems, of which there was a huge genre of these like liturgical poems that were incorporated into the liturgy at different times. This one is from Shavuot. We have a few of them, like we say Akdamos, we say Yitziv Pitgam, like all these things. They had them all the time. I grew up in a community that said Yotzros, actually, that's a misstatement. My community did not say Yotzros. The Hashkama, which had a German Gabbai, said Yotzros, which is like these poems for special Shabbatot or whatever. So here's something. Archein Yavi, I guess, right? The Lord, that's Hashem, right? God brought down Shemaya Sinai, Sinai to the heavens, right? Or sorry, heaven to Sinai. Actually, I took this translation from the Torah, but that doesn't seem right, right? God brought down the heaven to Sinai, right? Which is again sort of like pointing out that there's this meeting of two things that shouldn't be meeting. And he said to Moshe, Mehemne Tahasuk, right? My faithful one, come ascend. Moshe is called the faithful one. It's like a kinoi because he's Bechol Beiti Ne'eman Hu. Okay. My courtiers won't make you tremble, right? Because he did not sach yaton savach mean Resha. Your ancestor defeated them a long time ago. Who's that? What ancestor defeated the angels a long time ago?
Yaakov.
Yeah, fair. Okay. What does Yaakov have to do with this Aggadot? The angels certainly don't feel like they've been defeated, right? They seem perfectly willing to start up. It seems clear that this knows that Aggadot.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure that Yaakov defeated the angel either, but the angel did
That's
give
also
him
a
his
good
name.
question. Did Yaakov defeat the angel? There's so many questions about this. I mean, whatever, there's some poetic license. I just want to bring in another piece of information, which I happen to think is maybe behind this. There's a whole, it appears in many places in different Aggadot, the idea that Yaakov's face is etched on God's throne. Has anyone ever heard that? No.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. There's a whole chapter on it, I think, in James Kugel's in Potiphar's house, which I just said to somebody. I was like, I read that when I was young, so I still remember what it says. Go young people, keep learning things. But right, so right, there's this idea that Yaakov's face is on the Kisei HaKavod. So this is why I was saying, right, Meches Pnei Kisei. I don't know if it's actually present in our Aggadot, but there's another, right, if part of the question of unpacking our Aggadot, when God says, answer them by holding on to my throne, right? Part of it is God is protecting. Part of it is God is saying, actually, you're at a higher spiritual level. Part of it might be saying, like, not only are you at a higher, I've already previously decided that the Jews are up here with me, right? I already put Yaakov up here, right? Moshe, you just have to access that pre-existing path, right? That seems to be sort of what this poem is also saying.
I feel like you could also read it a different way.
Sure.
That that it's earned, not, God has prepared the place, but that his ancestor earned the place for him. That, that if Yaakov did wrestle the angel down until morning and all that, and he did win, and yet the angel refused to give him his name. So Yaakov's owed an angel's name. And then we hear the other Aggadot that that the angels did give Moshe at the end of it their names. So so there's already that path that's been like blazed for him, I guess, by his ancestor.
Or some kind of gift, right? That's interesting, right? There's a pre-existing debt, right? That like Yaakov kind of like is owed a debt through what he did, even if he didn't quote unquote win. He didn't get what he deserved out of that confrontation. It's been waiting for him this whole time, almost. Like that's an interesting thing. Yeah, thank you. Right, that there's something, and maybe that's also right. If you say like God put Yaakov's face up there, it's kind of like, oh, it starts with right, that Moshe, sorry, when Yaakov goes to sleep, he sees the ladder with his fate with angels coming up and going down. And the Midrash says, oh, they're comparing the lower Yaakov to the upper Yaakov. That's one of like the sources of this idea, but forgot about that for a second, right? But like, right, there's something about like Moshe. One of the questions which I'm not so super interested in, I actually am sort of interested in the opposite, is like Moshe sui generis. Moshe is the only person who can go up to heaven, and the answer is like actually not 100%, right? There's actually a pre-existing relationship about sort of like the bridging of these two worlds that Moshe is keying into, either God's decision or through Yaakov's actions, right? Yaakov has already helped pave that path for him. Thank you. So, okay, and the last line from here, later in the same poem, the kabait karne hoda. You received horns of glory or splendor, which hopefully we'll see at the very end. Right, Moshe after her chet ha'egel, he comes down, his face is shining. Karan or panav. Here it's taking it literally, which there's like some famous paintings of Moses with horns, right? So this, exists in old Aramaic poetry also. Right, this is what Isaac pointed out to me. Horns of glory and splendor on your head. If angels come near, gore them with them, right? Tunagshin, right? You can gore them with these horns, right? That Moshe, right? If Moshe is afraid of their fiery breath, here it's saying like, no, Moshe, you have your own fire, right? I'm giving it to you. There's something about how, right? Like almost similar to our first text, right? Receiving the Torah makes Moshe, or not receiving, but Moshe is somehow angelic-ish, but in a way that's actually more able to receive the Torah than the angels are. Anyway, okay. I want to go back to our Gemara, and if we have time for the Meshech Chachma, we will, and if we don't, we won't. And you can look at it, but that's okay. So now we're going to have another. I'm actually going to skip this. There's a Rabbi Shua Levi said when Moshe went up to heaven. Sorry, when Moshe came down. Right, Bishashi Erbad Moshe. When Moshe came down, now Satan is like, wait a minute, like where'd the Torah go? And goes and asks everything in the world, where's the Torah? They're all like, I don't know. He finally finds Moshe, and Moshe says, it's not with me. Or Moshe avoids the question. He says, who am I that God would give me the Torah? He doesn't say yes or no, but he sort of deflects. And God says, because you said that, I'm going to call it Torah Moshe. Okay, but that's sort of like I think, I'm not sure exactly what to say other than it feels like an inverse of what came before. Right, before the angels are reluctant to let the Torah go and then they agree, but then once they go, they sort of have second thoughts. Or at least one of them has second thoughts, and Moshe has to evade them again. But this time, instead of making a straightforward argument of like, no, I deserve it, the Torah is written for people, he has to sort of avoid. But God, that was the right thing to do here also. Okay. Right, and what Moshe says there is actually, should I take credit for myself? Right, like there's something about this process by which Moshe is really just the conduit. The things that are happening to Moshe are symbolic of the connection that's being made between God and the Jewish people, maybe. And the last thing I want to see is here. Well, I don't know about the last, but one of them. Amar Yeshua ben Levi b'sha'asha Allah Moshe l'Ramam. Again, when Moshe went up, Mitza'ola Kadosh Baruch Hu sheyosher kitarim la'otiyot. He found God tying little crowns on the letters, like the little what we call the tagin. There's again the famous Agacha of Moshe and Rabbi Akiva starts the same way. God willing, we'll read it next week. Amar lo Moshe in shalom be'ircha, and God was like, "Do you not know how to say hello?" Moshe's just kind of like standing there waiting awkwardly in the corner, as it were. And Moshe says, Klumish Evich, notain shalom aro, like, I'm here, I'm like the butler. I don't say good morning, I wait for you to notice me. Right? That's like the socially appropriate thing for me to do is to wait for you to notice me. Amar lo, hayalachal azreini. And God's like, well, if you're the butler, you should be helping me. So then Moshe gives him a bracha. He says, may the power of the Lord be great, which is sort of opening this idea of Moshe as like maybe similar to the Torah Shabbat Peh thing we saw before. Moshe is almost like being asked to participate in, to contribute something to the Torah, that receiving the Torah is not just a passive action on Moshe's part, but that he has to do something in order to receive it. He has to do something to the Torah almost. I think that's like very potentially fruitful. I want to bring one more. Is it not here? Oh, I didn't put it here. One sec. No. I'm just going to stay outside because there's not a lot of time anyway. But this whole idea of the crown of glory and all of that, I can open it actually with that. How many people are following this not on my sheet? Is anyone? No, I'm going to open for a second the same Gemara. Let's see if it's in my, no, it's in my history. Basically, there's another Gemara that says at the time, we started with Nasev and Nishma, right? There's a Gemara that says, when Bnei Israel said Nasev before Nishma, they, nope. Here we go. Nope. I don't know where it is. Okay. When Bnei Israel said Nasev and Nishma, right? A whole bunch, 1,200 or 600, I think it's like 600,000 angels came down and put two little crowns on their heads. And then when they sinned with the Egel, 120 or 1.2 million, I guess it would be double, came and took the crowns away. Right. So, and then Hulan Natal Moshe, and Moshe took them all. Moshe received all of these special crowns that Bnei Israel received. Bnei Israel got this prize for receiving the Torah. They got these crowns, and Moshe ended up receiving all those crowns himself. What's the proof of that? When Moshe comes down after Chet HaEgel, his face is shining, right? Which opens, that's like a whole other direction, but there's something about Moshe, like, I guess that's like a lead into what I want to say next time, but also here, right? Moshe is sort of, he's able to go face to face with the angels. We'll see. I guess I'll look at the Meshach for a second because of something about his status, right? He's able to go up there and maybe even contribute to the Torah, be closer to the Torah, be closer to God's throne in a way that the angels are not, because he has both, right? He's both a highly elevated and perfected person, and he's, from the world that the Torah was written for. But, right, part of the question of these Aggadot, I think, for us is like, well, where do we come in? Right? Does that mean that like we also have this access and the Torah Shabbat Peh is our way or something like that? Or does it mean like, and this sort of gets to the question I started with, so like how do we make sure that we can do that? Because right, there's a postscript to this story, which is Bnei Israel actually not worthy. They can't sustain that level of connection, and Moshe can actually sustain all of it for them. Right, Moshe is the one who sort of like carries all their shiny faces. This is actually referenced in, well, probably, right? Moshe receives also like a crown or some sort of present when he receives the Torah. We talk about this every week on Shabbat in the Amidah. Yismach Moshe right? Moshe got a special present because you called him a loyal servant. You gave him a special crown, right? Sinai, right? When he stood before you on Har Sinai, right? So Moshe is sort of like the first to receive this present or crown, almost, right? Bnei Israel receive it with him, but then they lose theirs and he keeps it. So maybe that's a way to end, is sort of like, what's special about Moshe? Different than the Rav Kook at the beginning about how Moshe might be like, particularly aligned. Here's Meshech Chochmah, Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. This is also my translation, so I apologize. I sort of paraphrased. So he says, what kind of perfection did Moshe have that he could receive the Torah? And he comes at it from an interesting question. If Moshe is already so special, right? God has already chosen Moshe. God has already spoken to Moshe at the burning bush. God has already done all these miracles with him. Why is it? How does receiving the Torah affect him? right? Does receiving the Torah change Moshe? So we saw before, right? Being upstairs gives Moshe access to special presence from the angels, right? That's one way of maybe talking about that, right? Like even Moshe, who's already so holy, gets something new through this revelation. So he starts with this like little dig at philosophers. Philosophers think that you have to achieve intellectual perfection and connect to I think he's talking about the active intellect, all this sort of like Aristotelian terminology, right? You achieve eternity of your soul by connecting it to these bigger things. He's like, by the way, this is accessible to like one person every few generations, and like that's not the Torah way, right? And also, right, this particular view of philosophy leads to some level of determinism, and God is not like an agent in history, because that would imply that God is missing things. Good things just sort of happen, right, as caused by God. Okay. But he says, no, the Torah has enlightened us. Lo kain he'ir Hashem yitbarach einenu. This is how God, that's not what God taught us through the Torah. God gave us the Torah and did all these miracles to show us that actually God, like the nature isn't just like a clock that's turning without just like any intervention. God can control everything. God can turn everything upside down if God wants, and doesn't. Right? What's the point of that? For us to see, since God created the world at will, God can say that we can access eternity if we want. God can give us understanding if God wants, right? There's no like philosophical necessity of like who you have to be to access heaven. Right? But what is there? There's this magical formula called the Torah. Magic is maybe a bad word, but right, there's this formula called the Torah, which is the thing that helps you circumvent this need for intellectual perfection, right? God has created a different path. And there's, this kind of terminology comes up in different chassidut and different philosophies in different ways, but right, there's one path is like the path of intellectual perfection. Maybe, okay, he seems to have problems even with that, like in the abstract, but actually the real path is the Torah. The Torah is like, it just works, right? Because God said it works. You don't have to understand how could it be that people can, like access heaven or whatever. Like the Torah is the thing. And if you do the Torah truly, then that will help you achieve perfection. Right? If you act, okay, and here he's talking about if your choice overcomes the laws of nature, right? You use your will to overcome what you would otherwise do. He goes in this little excursus about, people who like, the Rav Soloveitchik also has a famous passage, or recently made famous, right, where he like, not so recently, like of a husband and wife, like she says, like I saw a tiny speck of blood and they separate, right, so the Jews can like overcome their urges or drives or whatever. That's how you perfect yourself. And he says there's a big difference between this approach and the philosophical approach. Here it is. Yesh Hebdel Prati, there's a general difference and a specific difference. Okay, Hebdel Klali, Ki al yedei hanaga ba'olam, right? First of all, the first difference is that people can, by following the Torah, achieve perfection, even without necessarily being intellectually perfect. A person with a job and a bunch of other concerns, if they follow the Torah, can still connect to God, and that means it's not like a once in every few generations. It's like it's accessible, right? The other difference is, right, if you talk about attaching to God through the intellect, it means that like you're trying to sort of like separate obviously, I don't know, this terminology may be a little bit like vague, or sort of what does it even mean? I know I see the time. I'm going to finish in 1 minute if that's okay. But if you have to go, you can go. Or 2 minutes, right? You have to separate your soul from your body, and then your soul can attach to God. He's like, no, the secret of the Torah is that it can attach even your body to God. And he has this amazing reading where when Moshe first, and that's what Moshe achieved at Har Sinai. When Moshe first received God's revelation at the burning bush, God says, take off your shoes, right? Because actually, right, there's some way in which your body and attaching to me don't work together, right? That's sort of like a message of separating the physical and the spiritual, but that at Har Sinai, there's some unification. And then he goes on to say, but Moshe himself actually, like, because of his body becomes so rarefied, that's why Moshe is not buried, which is also like very interesting. There's nothing left to bury, he says. Very interesting. But I think that's kind of, I don't know, I like this as like a way to put it together, right? If Moshe is fighting with the angels about like, do I really as a human deserve to be here? The answer is like, the secret of the Torah is that it's for humans to help them access heaven, right? To help them and to access heaven in a way that angels can't, which is to fully bring your body along for the ride. Or not fully, but to bring your body along from the ride in some way, to sort of, elevate the spirit, physical, or whatever, different terminology around that kind of thing. But that ultimately this is perhaps part of the conclusion of the Moshe angel drama, is that like Moshe has something that they don't, and what Moshe has that they don't is the ability, not that everybody can just do it, but humans have a path to a connection that angels don't. And to, right, if God made the world for a reason, that people are the ones who can bring the world into its fruition, I would say. That's a place to stop. Thanks for coming. And I'm happy to take questions at the end or comments or whatever. Or Miriam, if you want to talk about what came at the beginning, call her or send me an email or whatever. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam Gedwiser, and thank you for everyone who's here for being part of our learning community. I see there aren't many people left, but yeah, other classes this month, Lessons and Legacies in Masachet Avot with Rabbi Yonatan Cohen is on Tuesdays at 9, if this is a time that works for you on other days. And yeah, there are more. You can sign up for those, whoever you signed up for this one. And yeah.
Thanks, Maxime.
Thank you.
Thank you.